You know that moment when someone suddenly says, "Why are you so quiet?" And even though they probably don't mean anything harmful by it, you instantly feel exposed, like somehow your silence has become something people need to analyze. Most people assume quietness means awkwardness, insecurity, or disinterest, but psychology suggests something much deeper is happening underneath that silence. Because people who don't talk much are often not disconnected from the world at all. In many cases, they're actually absorbing far more of it than everyone else around them. For years, I thought being quiet meant there was something socially wrong with me, like I needed to become more outgoing, more expressive, more entertaining just to function properly around people. You see this pressure everywhere. The loudest person in the room gets labeled confident. The most talkative person gets called charismatic. Meanwhile, the quiet person becomes mysterious or hard to read. But psychologists have been studying personality and social behavior for decades, and what they found is surprisingly counterintuitive. Silence is not always social weakness. Sometimes it's cognitive depth. Research consistently finds that quieter people often process information more deeply before responding, which sounds harmless until you realize how exhausting that can become in modern social life. Conversations move incredibly fast now. People interrupt each other, react instantly, and rush to fill every silence before it even exists. But if your brain naturally analyzes tone, meaning, emotional subtext, and possible outcomes before speaking, you end up experiencing conversations very differently from everyone else. And honestly, that difference changes everything. While other people are simply talking, your mind may be already noticing subtle things underneath the conversation itself. Tiny changes in facial expression, tension in someone's voice, forced laughter, emotional discomfort. Things most people overlook automatically become visible to you. And this is where the psychology becomes really interesting, because many people who don't talk much aren't socially disconnected, they're socially overloaded. There's a huge difference between those two things. Think about your mind like a browser with too many tabs open. Some people can keep adding stimulation endlessly without feeling overwhelmed. More conversations, more noise, more interaction. But quieter people often process social stimulation with much higher intensity. Their nervous system doesn't filter things out as easily. So eventually the brain adapts by becoming more selective about where energy gets spent. Not antisocial, just careful. Because people often mistake silence for emotional emptiness, when the opposite is frequently true. A lot of quiet people actually feel things very deeply. They replay conversations afterward. They analyze emotional tension long after everyone else forgets it happened. They think about whether someone sounded hurt, uncomfortable, or distant. And this creates a strange contradiction. From the outside, they appear emotionally calm, but internally, their mind is constantly active, constantly observing, constantly processing. Psychologists sometimes connect this to heightened sensitivity processing, where certain people naturally respond more intensely to emotional and environmental stimulation. Basically, some brains are wired to notice more and filter less, which means ordinary social situations can become mentally exhausting much faster than people realize. Over time, silence starts becoming less about shyness and more about energy conservation. Because when your mind absorbs everything deeply, interaction stops feeling casual. It starts feeling cognitively expensive. Now here's the part most people overlook. Being quiet doesn't necessarily mean you dislike people. In fact, many people who don't talk much crave meaningful connection very deeply. They just struggle with shallow interaction. Small talk can feel strangely draining when your mind naturally searches for sincerity, depth, and emotional authenticity. You don't just want to exchange words, you want the interaction to actually mean something. And when conversations stay surface level for too long, your energy slowly disappears without you fully understanding why. I think this is why group settings can feel exhausting for certain personalities. Group dynamics reward speed, the quickest joke, the loudest reaction, the fastest response. But depth moves slower. Reflection moves slower. Emotional processing moves slower. And people with quieter personalities often get misunderstood in environments built around constant stimulation. They begin feeling like they're bad at socializing when really their brain simply approaches interaction differently. Something subtle also happens over time when someone spends years being the quiet one. People begin projecting personalities onto them. They assume silence means arrogance. They assume calmness means emotional distance. They assume lack of talking means lack of confidence. And after hearing these assumptions enough times, many quiet people slowly stop trying to explain themselves altogether, not because they agree with those labels, but because constantly translating your inner world for others becomes emotionally exhausting. And honestly, this is where solitude starts feeling psychologically comforting. For some people, being alone feels empty, but for others, it feels like relief. Like finally taking off emotional armor they didn't even realize they were carrying all day. In silence, there's no pressure to perform socially, no pressure to react instantly, no need to filter every thought in real time. Now, obviously, there's an important distinction here. Enjoying solitude is not the same thing as painful isolation. Psychology makes a very clear difference between chosen solitude and chronic loneliness. One feels restorative, the other feels emotionally starving. And interestingly, people can experience either one regardless of how many friends they have. Someone can spend every weekend surrounded by people and still feel emotionally unseen. Meanwhile, another person can live a relatively quiet life with only a few close relationships and feel emotionally fulfilled because those connections genuinely nourish them. That's the part modern culture gets wrong so often. We keep measuring social success through visibility, how outgoing someone seems, how many friends they have, how socially active their life looks online. But psychology keeps pointing towards something much deeper. Human beings don't simply need endless interaction. They need meaningful connection. And quieter people often understand this intuitively. That's why they usually invest their social energy carefully. Not because they're incapable of closeness, but because emotional depth requires enormous energy for them. If these ideas resonate with you, subscribing helps this channel reach people who quietly experience these patterns but rarely hear them explained out loud. And honestly, sometimes realizing there's a psychological explanation behind your inner experience can feel deeply relieving. Here's one final thing worth understanding. People who don't talk much are often carrying conversations internally long after they end. They think about what they should have said, what someone meant, whether they sounded strange, whether they revealed too much or too little. And because most of this happens invisibly, other people rarely understand how mentally active quietness actually is. Silence can look empty from the outside, while internally it's full of thought, emotion, memory, imagination, and constant self-reflection. And maybe that's the deeper psychology underneath all of this. People who don't talk much are not always hiding from the world. Sometimes they're simply experiencing more of it internally than others can see. Their silence is not necessarily emptiness. Sometimes it's awareness. Sometimes it's emotional depth. Sometimes it's a mind that notices too much instead of too little. And once you understand that, you stop treating your quietness like something that needs to be fixed. You start seeing it as a different way of moving through the world. Not worse, not better, just different. And honestly, there's something deeply peaceful about realizing you don't have to become louder just to feel worthy of being understood. If this video connected with something you've quietly felt for a long time, subscribing or becoming a member genuinely helps support more of these psychology deep dives. But more importantly, it helps more people realize they're not alone in experiences they've spent years silently carrying by themselves.